I am really excited about our speaker and topic today. The topic is parent guidance on screen time and sleep hygiene during COVID-19, which we know has been kind of a significant and renewed challenge. And so Dr. Jean Yoon is going to be giving this talk today. Dr. Yoon just joined us a few months ago as part of our UCSF Child Psychiatry faculty. And she completed medical school at Ewha Women's University College of Medicine in Seoul, South Korea, where she completed her combined undergraduate and medical degree. She then completed her pediatrics residency at Cleveland Clinic and the post-pediatric portal program in child and adolescent psychiatry at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She has provided clinical care and teaching in both primary care and child and adolescent psychiatry at St. Christopher's Hospital in Pennsylvania, and also has provided urgent care in pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Yoon.
Thanks for the introduction, Petra. So thanks for joining the webinar. Today's talk is going to be on parent guidance on screen time and sleep hygiene during COVID-19. I do not have any disclosures, but our objectives for the webinar today is going to be to learn how to educate parents on the effects of screen time on children and how to give guidance on screen time use and how to promote healthy sleep habits during this pandemic especially. So if we take a moment to reflect on how our lives have changed in the past 3 months, I think COVID has really touched every aspect of our life, psychologically, physically, financially, and socially. And at least for me, the normal life we used to live pre-pandemic really feels like 3 years ago, not 3 months ago. And since the shelter in place took effect, I think I myself found that I was turning on the TV every morning at 9 o'clock to follow the New York governor's press conferences. I was off Facebook for a couple of years, and I have to admit, I rejoined Facebook, not just to check on my friends and how they're doing on the East Coast, but also I joined some COVID physician groups, and I felt like I was getting a lot more information through social media sometimes than the news platform. So that's been my personal screen time use, and I would have to admit it definitely went up. And I feel guilty about it because every Sunday morning my phone alarms me of my weekly screen time use, saying like, you have used 6 hours and 58 minutes a day this week, and that's like a 7% increase from the week prior. And I feel annoyed, but at the same time, I don't know how to turn that function off, so I just leave it and wait for the next report every Sunday. And this New York Times article I just came across and felt like it resonated with me. I feel like the coronavirus really ended the screen time debate, and screens did win. And the author talks about how most Americans, even before the pandemic, we probably pick up our phones like once every 8 to 10 minutes. And that actually amounts to probably picking up your phone and unlocking the background probably 80 to 100 times per day for the average American. And we feel guilty about it. We've tried all sorts of digital detox in various shades and have failed. But now with the pandemic, people are just really locked down at home. They're working from home remotely on screens. They're more often than not, if they have kids, they're also being the teachers for their kids' remote learning and also juggling the job of being a parent. So they feel like the battle's just been lost and they've given into the screens for themselves and for their kids. So I felt like the Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs fit very well to just explain what's going on during this pandemic. And the hierarchy of needs actually talks about how humans need to feel safe and protected with their most basic needs first. And once those are met, you can move on to the higher order needs and pursue them. So pre-COVID, I feel like most of us who were fortunate enough to have a roof over our heads and a secure job, we were more functioning in the top 3 tiers of the left pyramid. Just, you know, building social connections, working on meaningful relationships, self-esteem and career goals. And for the top few, they were just giving back to society. But with the pandemic, when that came, all of us kind of felt to the bottom 3 tiers, and we needed to feel safe, that we had enough food to eat. Panic buying started. I think all the aisles at the grocery stores were raided. We couldn't find any Clorox or bleach wipes. Masks, I don't think anyone could find them initially. And the interesting thing that happened in America and maybe Australia was that toilet paper ran out, and I'm not really sure why that happened. Once people felt like they had enough food stocked up at home, I think they moved on to starting to worry about, is my job going to be okay? Will I have a paycheck to be able to pay my bills, the rent? What about the mortgage? And people also started to worry about like their health and their family's health. I think we can resonate with that as like healthcare workers. Many people worried about bringing germs and COVID home to their spouses or their kids or their elderly parents, and started quarantining themselves. So once that was kind of down, I think we started reaching out, and we saw a new trend of people actually starting to reach out to old friends or relatives via social media platforms, video chatting. So, and I've been actually connecting pretty regularly with my friends on the East Coast or cross country, and my family is actually far away. So I've been checking in with them periodically over like FaceTime, and that's been very, very helpful. So this is one of my favorite childhood book series, The Bernstein Bears. And they have many books out there, but this one I still remember with all the details from cover to cover. So I remember the Too Much TV one and the Too Much Junk Food one. And now looking back at it, I feel like my mom bought those two with an agenda. And I remember it, so it worked. So how much TV are people actually watching in this pandemic? I'm sure many parents are worried about this. And if we look at the Nielsen TV survey, it compares from March of 2019 to March of this year during the COVID pandemic. There was almost like a 588% increase in the consumption of children and family movies. That's like almost 6 times. They also looked at the subscription rates for streaming services like Netflix or Disney Plus, Hulu, and that also changed within the past year up, and it was up about 52%. So that's like a significant increase. They also surveyed the percent increase in total TV usage by age group and during the time of the day. So the left graph actually shows the blue colors depict or represent the minors under 17 years of age, and the purple shades are showing the adults over 18. And you can see a big spike in the blue curve right in the middle. That's around daytime from 7 to 5, and it peaks around noon hours. And the light blue shade actually is the age group from 6 to 11, and that there's like a 300% increase in TV viewing there. And even for like the preteen and teen groups from 12 to 17, you see about a 250% increase in TV viewing. The adults are definitely watching more as well, but they're hitting around 50% increase. And the group or the graph on the right actually kind of analyzed what platforms are they using, what devices are they using to connect to view these TV broadcast shows. And the x-axis is looking at it by age, and the percent increase is around 350% in the 6 to 11-year-old age group, and the most common device they're using to connect is an internet-connected device like tablets, smartphones, whatever it may be, followed by the game console, the pink curve. So that has increased about 250% in usage. And the light blue curve is kind of tilted or shifted to the 12 to 17-year-old group with a 300% increase. And that shows that they're connecting more through broadcast TV. This is one of my favorite slides. While doing research for this talk, I came across a really fun article that it's called "Don't Touch That Dial" by Von Bell. And the writer gives a quick history of the fears people have had as new forms of communication enter our culture. So from the very far left, in the 16th century, a Swiss scientist actually warned against the dangers of the overabundance of information that was going to be released or unleashed from the printing press. And he thought that it was going to be very confusing and harmful to our minds. And then 2 centuries later, in the 18th century, once the newspapers became more common, the French statement was like against getting news from the printed page, arguing that newspapers were going to socially isolate the readers and detracted from the uplifting group practice of getting news from the pulpit. Following this, since literacy became essential and schools were needed for education and it was introduced to the public, like actually the weekly medical journal argued that schools are going to exhaust the children's brains and the nervous system and possibly ruin their bodies by protracted imprisonment, which I think no one in the modern age would argue that. And coming to the 20th century, when the radio came out, they thought it was going to disturb the balance of the young children's excitable minds and just cause a lot of attention divide from schoolwork. With the comic books coming out, they were actually really accusing the comic books for turning teenagers into criminals and making them promiscuous. And the US actually banned comic books, which I wasn't really aware of. So I learned a new fact. In the 1950s, when the television became more widespread, it was described as being addictive and isolating. And in 1961, the TV programming was actually described as the vast wasteland by the FCC chairman during a speech. And he was really trying to steer broadcasting channels for better programming. So I think that was, it had its agenda. So in the 70s, with the Atari coming out and video games kind of spreading out wide, parents were really fearing video game addictions and it causing aggression in our children. And then moving on to the 90s, once the personal computers entered our homes and with the birth of the internet, I was quite surprised. I guess I wasn't reading the news back then, but like actual big media outlets like CNN headlines read, "Emails hurts the brain more than pot." And I think if that was true, we would be in a lot of trouble currently. So in the 21st century, with the birth of smartphones and tablets towards like 2007 to 2010, this alarmist approach of media didn't really back down. And even the New York Times had published an article on the lure of data. Is it addictive? They were raising questions of whether technology could be causing ADHD. So the author of this article actually made a point that all of these pieces with flashy alarmist headlines have one thing in common. They don't really mention like hard evidence or studies, scientific bases about how the technology is affecting our mind or brains. And people often assume that new means of communication are more dangerous than their predecessors. And someone named like Douglas Adams also observed that people seem to think that technology that existed when you were born seems to be normal and okay. And anything that is developed and comes along before you turn 35 seems cool and exciting. but anything that comes after you turn 35 is something to be very suspicious about. And I think that's quite funny. So the author stresses how suspicion about new technology is often unfounded. So I thought it would be worthwhile to kind of review what literature is actually out there so we can use that in educating our parents with some evidence-based studies. So what I did was I reached out to my mommy friends saying, I had this webinar coming up. What do you want to know about? What questions, what concerns do you have? And all of them replied, thankfully, with different questions, kind of the same, but just different wording. And I kind of categorized it. It seemed to fall into 4 big categories or pillars. And they wanted to know what the screen time or how it was affecting their child's development and how much is too much. Is there like a golden number that I should keep it under? Content, like what's good, what's bad, and how do I find it? How do I monitor it? And how does that limits on screen time use without my child melting down? So why are parents so concerned about screen time messing up their child's brain? I think we're, like we just saw in the previous slide, like we're exposed to all kinds of media reports of screen time affecting the child's development and how important early childhood is as a time of rapid growth and the brain being plastic and response to experiences and what we expose our children to. So I think parents are rightfully concerned about this screen time negatively or possibly affecting their children's development and asking appropriate questions about, like, will it rewire my child's brain? Am I killing my child's brain power by letting them view screens? And is it going to lead to attention problems? So in order to understand this, a lot of the literature on development was really focused on under 5, like the early childhood. And I think it's important to kind of understand how young children learn. And I was a pediatrician too, but I'm not a developmental specialist and I'm not an early educator. So it was quite interesting to just read through the literature and learn about these theories. So based on previous TV studies, they believe that the comprehension of the screen develops after a child turns 2. So before that, they don't really understand what they're watching. And they learn best from like hands-on experiences through a trusted caregiver that is there for them consistently, giving them some reaction, back and forth reaction. The social relevancy theory is another important concept to understand in children, especially under age 2, as it's believed that they learn best from like meaningful objects or familiar people like moms, grandmoms, caregivers, teachers, nannies, someone who they see consistently and they like. And there was like a small study that experimented with the social relevancy theory and divided toddlers into 2 groups. One group was exposed to like rote learning skills through the screen delivered by like a popular cartoon character like Mickey Mouse that the US children knew of and were exposed to. And the other half of the group was exposed to an unfamiliar cartoon character. That character was also famous in Taiwan, but the US children who grew up here were probably not familiar and never had seen them before. And when they measured the skills for learning at the end, it was found that the kids who interacted with Mickey Mouse or the familiar character retained more skills than the other group. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And with screens, toddlers have to transform the information they see on a 2D flat screen into like a 3D world. And this can be challenging at times, especially if the screen is throwing a lot of visual and auditory like stimuli simultaneously, and it's hard for them, it's overwhelming for them to process that. And another concept comes in with how these toddlers under 2 have difficulty comprehending a technique called cinematic montage in the film techniques. It's often used in movies, like commercials, shows, and it's a skill that you need, like basically to infer from two individual shots, still cuts that have no relationship in time or logic. So the next concept is a very important one too, the video deficit. And Georgetown did a study with the Children's Digital Center in 2010. And it describes how toddlers can have difficulty differentiating between something they watched on a video and the same material being played out live in person. They don't really know the difference. So what they did was they took a bunch of 2.5 to 3-year-old toddlers and divided them into 3 groups. And each was treated with a different version of a show that took place in a laundry room with puppets hiding in certain scenes. And the first group was given just like a tablet to watch the show on passively. The second group was given an interactive game version of it, but you actually had to hit like a space bar to lift like the laundry basket, look behind the curtains to see where the puppets were hiding. And then the third group was watched a live show of this in like through a puppet theater, but the puppet theater was actually cut out in the TV frame. So they exposed these kids to the content, and then they actually pulled the kids out and threw them in a real laundry room setting with the puppets hidden in the exact places that they viewed it. And the results were pretty surprising. Like the second and the third group where the kids watched the live puppet show, and the kids who played the interactive game and tried to interact to see where the puppets were hiding, when they were released into the live version of the room, they beelined and found where the puppets were without any trial and error. But the first group who watched it passively on a flat screen didn't know what to do, and they were just trying to figure it out from the beginning. So something about that interacting with the content and pressing like a button to figure out where it is through the screens seemed to improve their ability to learn. So another concept is that around 15 months, it is thought that toddlers can learn words from touch screens or live video chatting, but they may have trouble transferring what they're seeing through a screen into the real world. So hence comes in this scaffolding hypothesis, where it's really important for an adult to interact with the child during the media use. So what they're seeing on the screen, if they're seeing like a trash can, like through a picture book on the screen, then you want to point out where it really is in your house. So that's an important concept. So for older toddlers and preschool age kids, interactive screen media can have a positive effect on rote learning. And educational TV shows like Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Blue's Clues, is known to have a positive impact on vocabulary, literacy skills, social emotional behavior, and it helps with school readiness. And it improves academic performance, which is actually traceable through high school years. The picture here, I'm a proud auntie. She's one of my friends, one of my best friend's daughters who lives in Jersey right now. She's 4 going on 5, and it's a success story of Zoom babysitting, actually. Her mom was working from home, and they have 3 kids. She had a 9 o'clock meeting every single morning that she could not get out of. And she asked for help through Zoom babysitting, and her mother-in-law stepped in to watch the kids for an hour each day. And mommy didn't know what was going on during the Zoom video babysitting sessions. And 8 weeks later, one day, this child is reading over mommy's shoulder, and she can actually read Korean. She speaks Korean, but she didn't know how to write or read it. And I didn't believe her. And this was me asking her to spell my name for me. And she did it, and her penmanship's actually pretty impressive for a 4-year-old. I think it's better than when I was 10. And so that's a story when you do use screen media or media for like educational purposes with the right caregiver being able to interact with the child. So other studies show that the parental use of devices and background TV is quite harmful for kids. And it's thought to be because the quality and quantity of the parent-child interaction is leading to delays in language and cognitive skill development. After age 6, a lot of kids are watching more adult entertainment programming, but there's really little research on the cognitive outcomes of kids watching adult programming. It's very evident that actually violent TV content and violent video games are influencing kids' aggressive behaviors. So that's something that you really want to monitor content for. But more research is definitely needed on differential effects of interactive media content. That's actually not a well-pioneered area of research yet. So the big question that came up was, does screen time cause attention problems? The short answer to this is it's mixed results, so I would have to say it's inconclusive. And the most cited study, I guess, that came out in 2004 from Seattle Children's was that they looked at the hours of TV that a toddler age 1 to 3 was exposed to, and then when those kids turned 7, they kind of surveyed how many of them had ADHD. However, the problem with that study was that they couldn't really prove a direct causal relationship between the hours of TV causing the ADHD, and the limitations were that, you don't know if they were plopped in front of the TV for more hours because of limited parenting skills or low socioeconomic status, versus just strictly the exposure in the best of environment. And a follow-up study in 2007 kind of tried to differentiate the content. And that study actually reported that there was an increased risk of developing attention problems for the kids who watched non-educational entertainment shows, but the kids who watched educational shows, there wasn't an increased risk. But many of these studies, they just need to work more on differentiating the content that these kids are exposed to. They need more longitudinal studies. Most of the studies that are out there are only following them up 3 to 5 years later, and that's it. And it's also, there are a lot of variables that play into development, and they need to take more background information and correct for those factors. So how much screen is too much? This was like the next big question. And I think it's a compound question in this case. Like, they really want to know, like, if we let the kid watch too much, is it going to cause poor development, which we already reviewed, poor health outcomes physically, any depression or mood problems. The other big one was, the more I let them watch, are they going to get addicted? So this guideline was from the WHO that just came out in 2019, pre-COVID. WHO is a little bit more strict. I think they say no screen for kids under 1, and kids like under 4, like less than 1 hour of sedentary screen time. And then the pre-COVID guidelines from the AAP kind of evolved over the past decade. Initially, they were a lot more stricter on just the hours of screen time. I think at first we were all giving guidance about no more than 2 hours a day, even for your older kids. And for the younger ones, no more than 1 hour a day, and no screen for kids under 2. They've kind of moved on from that blanket statement, focusing more on the content and making sure that they're doing all their offline activities first, getting some physical activity and making sure they're sleeping okay, but also focusing on the content, being educational, non-violent, and stressing the importance of co-viewing with the kids so you can interact with them. So this slide actually is a snapshot of children's media use in the UK. By age 5 to 7, about 40% of the kids actually own their own tablet. And by age 12 to 15, 80% own a smartphone. And 3 out of 4 teens are on at least one social media site. And 1 out of 4 teens actually self-report that they're constantly connected to the internet or social media. About 80% of the families own some sort of device to play video games on. And even before the smartphone and the tablet era in 1999, the average screen time used for children was surveyed to be around 6 hours a day. And 10 years later, around like when smartphones just started coming out, it increased to about 7.5 hours a day. So I'm sure like 10 years later right now, we'd probably be using a lot more screen time. So how much is too much? Is there a right amount of technology use? And the Goldilocks effect, or this theory actually argues that maybe moderate engagement in online and digital activity is beneficial in terms of our subjective mental well-being and team connectedness. So this graph on the left, actually it's a 2017 study. It's just one study out of many. I want to point that out, that it measured the mental well-being against like how many hours they're actually engaging in digital screen media. And it kind of peaks in the middle around like 1 or 2 hours of use, but the mental well-being is reported to be less if you're not using any or if you're using a lot more. The graph on the right is from a 2015 report from the OECD from different countries, and they surveyed like excessive or extreme internet users. And I don't know that they could really define what is considered extreme, but I think they were looking at reports that were 6 hours or more per day. And those extreme users are depicted in this graph as the green bars, and the average internet users are the blue dots on the right. So the more far to the right you plot on, you're reporting more better life satisfaction. And you can see the average users are actually reporting more life satisfaction, and the extreme users are reporting less life satisfaction. And it was also reported that they were reporting to be more likely to be bullied at school, performed worse in standardized testing. So it seems like that moderate use of digital technology has small positive effects, and no use or too much use can have small negative impacts. But if you look at the meta-analyses on these studies, the negative effects are really negligible, plus the positive or negative effects are weak in explaining the direct causal relationship to mental well-being. So it might just be more important to focus on other factors like family functioning, social dynamics, at school, socioeconomic status, digital content, rather than the screen time alone. So this is a Pew Research data surveying the teens on social media use, and they actually report that they feel more included and confident with social media use rather than excluded or insecure. And they think it has positive outcomes on their social relationships. They also feel that the positives are they feel more connected because the children who communicate online more frequently tend to feel more connected to the school environment and have stronger peer relationships. And the digital technology by itself, it might not be a main effect cause, but you have to think about the contextual and individual factors that that child lives in that is impacting the social interaction and relationships. So the big question, does social media use lead to depression? This again is an area that I found mixed results in studies, so inconclusive. It's thought that certain types of social media use are risky, but others or certain ones can be protective. And there was actually an article published in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry magazine from the media committee that looked at social media and depression. And it's thought that there's evidence to suggest that social media habits and experiences do affect mental health, but the relationship is not direct and it's more complex than that. And they looked at several factors of individual characteristics that could place your child at higher risk for mood symptoms using social media. So it might be something to gauge parents to kind of keep a close eye on, especially if your child has underlying depression or anxiety. They're always on social media at bedtime, overnight, losing sleep over it. If they're a victim or actually the bully of cyberbullying, they're engaging in something like sexting. If your child has FOMO, like fear of missing out, or the teenagers who are high in social comparison. So the next slide, we're going to talk about, does screen time have any effect on physical activity? This one too, I think a lot of us think that it causes obesity, and some studies do report that. But then again, other studies couldn't replicate those researches. So it's mixed and inconclusive again. And I think eventually we have to address screen time and physical activity separately. Interventions targeting just screen time alone might not automatically increase their physical activity and outdoor activity. So that's something to think of giving anticipatory guidance. The other one is, does screen time cause vision problems or myopia? Definitely in the past 50 years, the diagnosis of myopia has increased in the US for children, but the research out there actually links development of myopia directly to the lack of outdoor activities and outdoor time, not so much screen itself. It is linked actually to your screen habits if you're holding the tablet too close to you, just like you would be holding a book too close. So I don't think, it would differ like whether you're reading too much closely versus watching a screen too closely. It's probably the same risk. But what does affect development of myopia if you're not spending enough time outside and getting exposure to natural light. And this is something new I found reading through the literature. It's actually thought that natural light is protective against developing myopia because it stimulates the retina to produce dopamine, and that is a protective factor against myopia. So the big question, will my kid develop a screen addiction? So I think if you ask, do some people have problems spending too much time online, the answer would be yes, whether it's an adult or a child. But also some people have been spending too much time reading, watching TV. Some of us are workaholics. We spend too much time at work and we don't leave enough time for family or kids, or friendships, social activities. The problem is I don't think we yet have a consensus on how to define addiction with screens, and some researchers actually feel very uncomfortable calling it an addiction. It's more of a problematic behavior, but how do we define addiction in kids with screens? Like the clinical sense of an addiction is you would have to have some kind of impairment in social functioning, occupational functioning, academic functioning, and researchers have been struggling to prove that these kids are having that degree of impairment. But there's really no good evidence-based literature out there, and even the brain imaging studies are in their very early stages. So there's not yet any evidence to suggest that digital technology use alone causes any restructuring of the brain or rewiring of the brain so far. And with the addiction research over the past 30, 40 years, I think it has evolved as well. So it's a little bit more complex than the simple dopamine theory. So They think addictive behaviors are more of a consequence of multiple individual, like genetic and environmental factors. So it's not just the substance itself that will cause it. So screen time alone causing addiction is probably a misinterpretation. So does screen time affect sleep? 97% of US adolescents own at least one electronic device and keep it in their bedrooms. And I'm quite surprised that 70% of teenagers are allowed to take their cell phones and crawl into bed, and 60% can crawl into bed with a tablet. Doing the literature review, I think this was the most consistent area that I could find the most evidence, like the strong evidence for. 90% of the studies actually could replicate and show that screen time is adversely associated with sleep outcomes. It usually leads to less overall sleep duration, but also delays the circadian rhythm because it affects the melatonin production. So this is a chart on just recommended sleep times published in the AP. As we all know, like little babies, 4-month-olds can sleep like 16 hours or most of the day, except for when they're asking to eat or feed or letting you know that they're soiled. So 12 to 16 hours a day. And you would think teens would need much less, but actually not that much less. They do need about like 10 hours a day, and most of our teenagers are not getting that much sleep. So how do we establish healthy sleep habits? I think it's very important to establish a bedtime routine and hold to those standards and be very consistent with them. It's important to turn off all electronics, no tablets, no phones, no computer games, at least an hour before bedtime. And it's well known that cool and darker environments are better for sleep. So just make sure that the room that your child is sleeping in is not too overheated or warm or damp. And the sleep routine, it really shouldn't vary more than plus minus an hour from day to day. And the Sleep Foundation also announced a COVID-19 sleep guideline. They talk about the normals that we know about, like bed is only for sleep. And if your child has difficulty falling asleep and they're tossing and turning for longer than 20-30 minutes, you just have them get up and do something relaxing like coloring, listening to some soothing music under dim light. And they really emphasize exposure to natural light during the daytime is helpful in keeping your circadian rhythm on time. And screen time, especially in the evening, is not good because the blue rays will interfere with your body's natural like melatonin production. If your child is over 6 and still napping and you find that they're having trouble sleeping at night, they really don't need naps. Naps should phase out between the ages of 4 and 6. So cut the naps out if that's happening. And it's important to be physically active, just, to make yourself feel good. Practice kindness, foster connection, use some relaxation techniques like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, some quiet reading. So this is like a sample sleep schedule by age group. I won't go over all the details of it, but also sleep specialists have been recommending to limit the sleep routine. So from getting dressed into your pajamas, getting story time with your parents, to falling asleep to be like less than 30 minutes compact. So you might want to do some firm limit setting with like 1 or 2 short stories for the sleep routine. Kids will start pushing boundaries like 1 more, mommy, or I want to go get a glass of water, I need to go to the bathroom. Everything should happen in 30 minutes. So these are some tips for helping stressed out kids sleep. It might be a good idea to kind of debrief and process what they're going through, what's on their mind in the afternoon or early evenings, and just talk about it with your child. And also as parents, I think it would be a good idea to check on your own stress level. And if it's spilling over, it might be worthwhile to just share with your child at a developmentally appropriate level, let them know mommy is really stressed out at work, or because this is happening, but I'm handling it this way, so we're all going to be okay. Sometimes we have some tough days. It's important to build some positive routines for the family, like together time, just cuddling in the bed and reading together, like a short game night. And if the child is really having persistent trouble sleeping by themselves, maybe it's an okay idea to back off from your strict rules of not crawling into bed with mom. Well, we don't want them to join your bed, but maybe let them nest in the parent's bedroom on like a sleeping bag or a mattress on the floor for a couple of days, with the expectation of returning to their own rooms within the week. So AAP also announced the COVID-19 screen time guidelines right after shelter in place took place. So they really emphasized more on the preserve the offline experiences and get physical activity, find some other activities to do other than spending time on screens, make a family media use plan. Parents should monitor their own screen time use so they can be good role models, and co-view the content and talk about it. So when we're giving guidance, I think it would be important to tailor it to the individual family's comfort level with setting limits, or their value systems or beliefs with screen time. And the 3 C's is a good method to use. You want to think about what your child likes or dislikes, what they're scared about. You don't want to show too much information that is overwhelming on the news to a kid who tends to be a little bit more anxious and worried. The content is important. Just based on the age and the developmental level, you want to make sure that little kids get more slow-paced content, and something more educational and interactive would be preferable. And context-wise, you want to make sure that you're really engaging in your child's media use, and you're co-viewing, asking questions, sharing opinions about the show with your children, and use it as family time to bond. So no screens like in the bedroom, I think, is a very important thing to emphasize with families, but also at the dining table or meal times. Those should be like, the family should agree on like certain screen-free zones and times, and make sure that they're getting adequate sleep. And the parents playing an active role is going to be very important. So how do you cope with kids who seem to have a screen obsession? So you might want to take a close look at when it's happening, like, and decide the timing of when they get to play with screens. Definitely, if you're giving it to them at a certain time and you notice they're having worse meltdowns because they don't want to do homework coming off of the screens, it might be a better idea to flip the schedule and make it a rule that they have to complete their schoolwork first to get screen time or earn screen time. Don't make screen time rules just based on time. I think especially this applies to the current situation where teenagers are really feeling isolated and missing their friends, and teens appropriately, they really value their peer relationships over family relationships, and they're really stuck with their own families at this point. So it might be, listen to them, like what's going on, what they're getting out of the screen use. And if it makes sense, I think the family can negotiate how much of what content they are using and engaging in. Also pay attention to your child's emotional relationship with screens. Don't use it as a pacifier. That's just kind of asking for more trouble down the road. I have patients who claim that screens are the only things that help their anxiety. I think partially it's true, but also you want to look at what it's causing. If it's causing trouble at night, they're using it as a coping skill, but they're using it all night and you're losing sleep over it. It's not helping your mood down the road. So set some firm limits if you understand what's actually going on. And make sure that like just taking the screen away is not going to solve everything. They need other things to do and cope with. So they need some coping skills. So you might want to help them find other activities to fill that void with. So for parental supervision, it's important to co-view. I think we've really emphasized that today. And keep device use in a common area so you can periodically check over their shoulders, making sure that they're not on inappropriate sites. For younger kids, make sure that you bookmark the kids' sites that they often go to so they don't end up at adult sites. And parents maybe need to monitor their credit cards because it's more often than not that your preschool kids somehow land on their mom's Amazon app and start ordering things, or they're already paying for like game items with mom's credit card. So they can also install online protection tools and apps, and we encourage that parents set up the kids' profiles for and accounts for social media if they're using it. I think Facebook and Twitter and most social media sites have a minimum age requirement of like 13 or 14. So for TV parental control, there's a technology called VChip that's embedded in most TVs that were produced after the year 2000. And it's a technology that blocks TV programs or movies that filter as mature or violent ratings. And you have to enter a PIN code to be able to access these. Video games and apps also have a rating system through the Entertainment Software Rating Board, so you want to pick the appropriate one for your child's age and developmental level. And I think this is another nice resource called Common Sense Media. It's like a nonprofit organization who works on rating children's apps and movies, digital content, and has a parental rating and also the Common Sense Media rating, and it's pretty helpful. It's like a media version of the Goodreads website. So I'll take any questions if anyone has any.
Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for sharing. This is super helpful, especially during this time of COVID. All of our kids are spending much more time on TVs or tablets. I have a question which comes from my patients. I found it difficult and challenging to talk to parents who are full-time working from home and they're sort of just using these video games or TV shows to parent their child, because these parents are really just know they don't have the availability and bandwidth. I wonder what will be a technique to speak with these parents to help them to build skills to spend more time supervising their child when they're on TV or limiting the time.
Yeah, I think that's really hard. And the reason why all these big AP and WHO, they've kind of backed off on the screen guidelines because they don't want to overwhelm and overburden parents in a time of crises. And similarly, I think in the pediatric world, like we tell parents, if the baby's crying so much and they're fussy and you feel overwhelmed, it's okay to let the baby cry out a little bit and take a break and come back rather than you going crazy and hurting the child. I think it's a similar situation where we don't want to overwhelm the parents, but at the same time, when they do have the bandwidth in between their work schedules, or at least having their children in a common space so they can periodically, even through a glance, just make sure that they're not in the wrong sites or inappropriate sites. And I think my point was, like with the TV viewing, at least set some parental control, like with the VChip technology. I think it's not been advertised very well, and although it's been existing for about 20 years, only 20 to 30% of the consumers know about it. So I think that's a good start. At least you set up some filtering on your TV so they're not watching inappropriate shows or like mature rated or violent rating shows or videos or movies. I think with game apps, it's a little bit more difficult. They might need to put some parental control guidance, like you don't buy things that are not appropriate for that age, or when they're downloading, make sure that the parents go through it first to make sure this is some content I'm okay with letting my children play. At least I think that's a minimum level that they can start at.
Just before we need to wrap up, there's a question from Margarita Miller about the use of melatonin. What do you think about that?
I think melatonin's pretty benign. I mean, definitely we want to work on the good sleep hygiene first, but melatonin is shown to be effective. We always want to start at a dose that is pretty small at the lower end. So 1 to 3 milligrams or less, about 30 minutes, at least 30 minutes before your targeted bedtime, I think is harmless. But definitely you want to be doing the good sleep hygiene and not just solely using melatonin as a crutch.
Great. Thank you so much, Jean, for this really wonderful presentation. We are at 1 o'clock, so really appreciate everyone's participation and questions and all of the wonderful and interesting information that you presented. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next week for our Trauma-Informed Care Principles 101 on June 25th. Look forward to seeing you there.
Okay, thank you for joining. Thanks.